It was early spring, the first real warm day of the season, and the air in the greenhouse felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. I was there to help my neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, an avid gardener in her 60s, with her prized greenhouse. She had asked me to come by to lend a hand, but when I arrived, I was surprised to find her friend Lillian already inside, carefully tending to a row of seedlings. Lillian was perhaps a decade younger than Mrs. Dawson, and her presence immediately filled the space. She had a quiet grace about her, an elegance that felt out of place among the garden tools and rows of budding plants. When she looked up, her eyes met mine with a spark of recognition, as though she had been expecting me all along. "Hello," she greeted softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the greenhouse fans. "You must be Jackson." "Yes, that's right," I replied, slightly taken aback by the intensity of her gaze. "I came to help with the plants." She smiled, a subtle smile that hinted at something more than friendly warmth. "I'm glad you're here. These plants are going to need a lot of attention today." Mrs. Dawson soon joined us, showing me around and pointing out the tasks she had in mind. But as the afternoon wore on, it was Lillian who remained close by, her movements slow and deliberate as she guided me through each step of caring for the delicate plants. There was a subtle tension between us, an awareness that grew with each shared glance, each accidental brush of our hands. At one point, she leaned in to show me how to handle the seedlings without damaging their fragile roots. Her hand rested on mine, steady and warm, her touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. I glanced up, and our eyes met in a charged silence. She didn't pull her hand away, and I felt a rush of something I couldn't quite define, an invitation, perhaps, or maybe just a flicker of mutual curiosity. "Thank you for showing me," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "It's no trouble at all," she replied, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. There was a softness in her gaze, a vulnerability that hinted at a shared understanding between us. The afternoon light softened as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the greenhouse floor. It felt as though we were suspended in a moment that could extend indefinitely, each of us lingering in the quiet intimacy of the greenhouse. As the sun began to set, painting the glass walls of the greenhouse with a warm, golden hue, Lillian and I continued working side by side, our movements synchronized without a single word. There was an unspoken connection between us now, something fragile yet unmistakable. Each time our hands brushed or our eyes met, it felt as though the air grew thicker, charged with a tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge openly. We were watering the plants when Lillian leaned over, a hint of lavender in her perfume filling the air around us. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and my heartbeat quickened in response, though I tried to keep my focus on the task at hand. But she didn't move away. Instead, she watched me intently, as if studying my reactions, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Jackson," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, "you have a gentle touch with these plants. It's a rare quality." The compliment was simple, but the way she said it, her tone, her gaze turned it into something far more intimate. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and felt a rush of warmth that spread from my chest to the tips of my fingers. "Thank you," Lillian, I replied, my voice equally soft, as if we were sharing a secret in the stillness of the greenhouse. "I suppose I've always had a bit of a knack for gardening." She smiled, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before she turned her attention back to the plants. Yet, even as we continued working, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken had passed between us, something that hung in the air like a whisper, waiting to be acknowledged. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Dawson excused herself, leaving Lillian and me alone in the fading light. I glanced at her, unsure of what to say, but she only smiled, a look of quiet assurance in her eyes. "Shall we keep going?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. I nodded, grateful for the distraction of work, though I could feel the tension building with each passing minute. We moved through the rows of plants, the silence between us growing heavier, charged with an intensity that neither of us seemed willing to break. Finally, as we reached the far end of the greenhouse, Lillian turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for helping today, Jackson. It's been a pleasure." There was something in her tone that sent a shiver down my spine, a subtle warmth that hinted at feelings left unsaid. I looked at her, searching her eyes for some clue, some indication of what she might be thinking. But before I could find the words, she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to brush a stray leaf from my shoulder. It was such a small, simple gesture, yet the touch lingered, her fingers grazing my skin in a way that sent a thrill through me. I felt a surge of emotions, curiosity, excitement, a quiet yearning that I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. Lily and I began, but my voice faltered as she looked up at me, her gaze intense, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Jackson," she replied, her tone soft, inviting. I swallowed, unsure of what to say, but before I could gather my thoughts, she took a step closer, her hand resting on my arm. The warmth of her touch was grounding, yet it also ignited something within me, a spark that I couldn't ignore. The silence between us grew thick, filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. I felt a pull toward her, a magnetic attraction that defied logic, that seemed to exist outside of time and reason. She looked at me, her gaze steady, as if she were waiting for me to make a decision, to take that final step. But before I could act, she smiled, a soft, almost mischievous smile, and withdrew her hand, turning back to the plants with a graceful ease. The moment passed, but the memory of her touch lingered, a gentle reminder of the connection we had shared, a promise of something more. As we continued working in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that our relationship had shifted, that we had crossed an invisible boundary into uncharted territory. Each glance, each brush of her hand seemed to hold a deeper meaning, a quiet intimacy that resonated between us like a hidden melody. The greenhouse was bathed in shadows by the time we finished, the air cool and still. As we stood together in the quiet darkness, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Lillian looked at me, a soft smile on her lips, and I felt a warmth in her gaze that eased my worries, that filled me with a quiet joy. "Thank you for today, Jackson," she said, her voice soft, her words carrying a warmth that wrapped around me like a gentle embrace. "It was my pleasure," Lillian I replied, my voice equally soft. "Anytime." We lingered in the silence, neither of us willing to leave, both of us caught in the quiet beauty of the moment. Finally, she reached out, her fingers grazing my hand in a touch that felt both innocent and intimate. "Good night, Jackson," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Good night," Lillian I replied, my heart pounding as I watched her turn and walk away, her figure disappearing into the shadows. The following days passed in a blur, each one filled with the quiet anticipation of seeing Lillian again. I found myself looking forward to the evenings in the greenhouse, to the moments of shared silence, to the unspoken connection that had blossomed between us. And each night, as we worked side by side, the tension grew, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to come alive. Our glances lingered a little longer, our touches a little more frequent, each one fanning the flames of the unspoken attraction that had taken root between us. One evening, as we were watering the plants, our hands brushed, and neither of us pulled away. Instead, we stood there, our fingers intertwined, the silence around us thick with anticipation. "Jackson," she murmured, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Yes," Lillian I replied, my heart racing as I looked into her eyes. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to our joined hands before she looked back at me, a quiet resolve in her expression. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, my breath catching as I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. But instead of speaking, she stepped closer, her hand resting on my cheek, her touch gentle yet firm. The air between us felt charged, electric, as if the greenhouse itself held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. And then, without another word, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, filled with a tenderness that took my breath away. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of rightness that defied explanation, as though we were two pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. The kiss deepened, each of us giving in to the pull that had been building between us for so long. Our hands found each other, our fingers intertwining as we stood there, wrapped in each other, the rest of the world fading into oblivion. When we finally broke apart, we stood in silence, our breaths mingling in the quiet stillness, each of us lost in the intensity of the moment. She looked at me, a vulnerability in her gaze that mirrored my own, and I felt a surge of emotions, joy, fear, a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. Lillian, I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. She pressed a finger to my lips, silencing me, a gentle smile on her face. Don't say anything, she whispered, her voice soft, filled with a quiet resolve. Just be here with me. And so we stood there, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the greenhouse, our hands entwined, our hearts beating in sync as we allowed ourselves to exist in the moment, without the need for words or explanations. The silence in the greenhouse felt sacred, wrapping around us like a veil, the only sounds coming from our steady breaths and the faint hum of the fans. I could feel the heat radiating from her, the subtle rise and fall of her chest against mine, grounding me in a moment that felt suspended in time. Lillian's hand lingered on my cheek, her touch soft but assured, and I felt myself drawn to her in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. We stayed like that, close and quiet, as if any sudden movement would shatter the spell between us. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the boundaries we were on the edge of crossing. There was a part of me that wanted to question this, to understand how we'd come to this moment, but another part, a deeper part, urged me to stay, to let go of the questions and just feel. Lillian looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and I saw a glint of something vulnerable, a flicker of doubt that mirrored my own. It was as if we both understood the fragility of what we were sharing, as if acknowledging it out loud would somehow break the quiet intimacy we'd found. Without a word, she rested her forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the stillness, and I felt an overwhelming surge of tenderness for her, a longing that went beyond mere attraction. I didn't know what this meant for us, for our lives outside this greenhouse, but right now, none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was the warmth of her touch, the soft brush of her lips as she leaned in again, our kiss deepening as we finally allowed ourselves to surrender to the pull that had been growing between us. As her hands moved to my shoulders, pulling me closer, I felt a rush of heat that spread through me, a raw, unfiltered connection that seemed to reach into my very core. Every touch, every glance, every shared breath felt like a confession, an admission of the feelings we had both been holding back. "Jackson," she murmured against my lips, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her fingers traced the line of my jaw, her touch sending shivers down my spine. I never thought I'd feel like this again. Her words, so quiet yet so full of meaning, hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a lump rise in my throat, a mixture of joy and sadness, as if we were both acutely aware of the fleeting nature of the moment. I pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, my hand coming up to cup her cheek, and she closed her eyes, leaning into my touch. "You're not alone in this, Lillian," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I've been feeling it too for a while now." She opened her eyes, and there was a glimmer of relief, a soft vulnerability that only made my heart ache more. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened, whatever challenges we might face, I didn't want to let her go. We were two people who had found each other in the quiet stillness of a greenhouse, amidst the flowers and the soil, and there was something achingly beautiful about that. We stayed wrapped in each other's arms, the outside world fading away, leaving only the two of us suspended in a moment that felt timeless. The greenhouse, with its rows of flowers and lush greenery, became a sanctuary, a place where we could be honest with ourselves and each other, free from the expectations and judgments of the world beyond. As the evening wore on, the sky outside began to darken, casting a soft, dim light over the greenhouse. Shadows danced across the plants, and the air took on a coolness that only heightened the warmth between us. We didn't speak, letting our bodies do the talking as we navigated the unfamiliar territory of this newfound intimacy. Our kisses deepened, each one filled with an intensity that left me breathless, each touch grounding me in a connection that felt as inevitable as it was unexpected. The lines between friendship and something more blurred, each of us surrendering to the feelings we had tried so hard to ignore. I lost track of time, of everything but her hands in mine, her soft laughter that broke the silence now and then, her gaze that held me captive with its mix of tenderness and passion. The world outside the greenhouse ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us in a cocoon of warmth and light. Finally, as the night settled in fully, we found ourselves lying side by side on the wooden bench, wrapped in a blanket we'd pulled from a shelf. The silence was comfortable, filled with the gentle sound of our breaths and the soft rustle of the plants around us. I held her close, my arm wrapped around her shoulders, her head resting against my chest, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. "This feels like a dream," she murmured, her voice soft, almost sleepy. I smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "If it is, I don't want to wake up." She let out a soft laugh, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my chest. Neither do I, Jackson. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other as the night deepened. The greenhouse was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, the air cool but comforting, and I felt as though we had stumbled upon something precious, something that belonged only to us. It was a moment outside of time, a quiet, hidden world where we could be ourselves without fear or hesitation. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the glass walls, casting a soft glow over the greenhouse, I felt a pang of sadness, a reminder that this moment couldn't last forever. We would have to return to our lives, to the realities we had left behind. But for now, I held her close, savoring the warmth of her presence, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, and the quiet peace that we had found together. When the morning came, we finally stirred, our movements slow and reluctant, as if neither of us wanted to break the spell that had settled over us. Lillian looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and sadness, and I felt my heart ache at the thought of parting ways. "Thank you, Jackson," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "for everything." I reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I should be thanking you, Lillian. You've changed something in me." She smiled, a soft, bittersweet smile that mirrored the emotions in my own heart. We stood there in silence, holding on to each other, both of us reluctant to let go, both of us aware that this was a moment we would carry with us, a memory that would linger long after we returned to our separate lives. Finally, we pulled away, the reality of the day settling over us like a quiet weight. We exchanged a lingering glance, a silent promise that this wasn't the end, that we would find a way to hold on to what we had shared. As I left the greenhouse and walked back to my own place, I felt a quiet warmth settle over me, a sense of peace that I hadn't known before. I didn't know what the future held, or if we would ever be able to truly be together, but I knew that we had shared something beautiful, something that had changed us both in ways we couldn't yet understand. Over the days that followed, we continued to see each other in the quiet moments, exchanging glances, sharing smiles, both of us acutely aware of the connection we had forged. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding, a bond that defied explanation, a love that had blossomed amidst the flowers in the soil. And though the world around us remained unchanged, we knew that we had found something rare, something precious, a love that would forever remain a part of us, a quiet reminder of the beauty that could be found in the most unexpected places.